the fall of 1692, as the Salem witch trials roiled New England, a darker, more powerful hunt was still underway in the foggy cobblestone streets of New Amsterdam, now New York City. 2 or 3 lives lost, no trial, no record, no mercy. For more than 3 centuries, that story was buried in the ashes of a devastating 1911 fire that destroyed the local archives and all evidence. But recently discovered private letters from the Steverant family estate reveal a much more certain truth, a web of intrigue, fear, and political manipulation that makes the Salem story look like child's play, and the truth of the final months of 1692 will make you look at early American history in a whole new light. Before we dive into the first chapter of the Vandermeer tragedy and the merchant conspiracy that wiped out an entire family, Sleepy History Tales invites you to become part of our community of history buffs. Hit the subscribe button and let us know which city or state you're listening from. We'd love to see how far back in history we've come. Now, let's take a trip back to old New York when it was still called New Amsterdam and join us in discovering what really happened on those foggy, shadowy streets that year. In 1692, New York, or New Amsterdam, as many of its Dutch-born residents still called it, was in turmoil. It had been 28 years since the British had claimed the Dutch address, but the small city of fewer than 4,000 people was still a patchwork of conflicting languages, faiths, and loyalties. Stone houses with Dutch terraced roofs crammed Pearl Street, while English wooden houses rose ever closer to the old Dutch Reformed Church. Governor Benjamin Fletcher sat in the James Fort, but his power was by a thread. In fact, the Dutch merchants still controlled the city's lifeblood, the fur trade. In the narrow alleys near the east, 3 great families controlled all trade. The Vandermeer's 2 brothers from Harlem, who dominated the grain business. The Livingstons, a Scottish family with an unknown fortune. And the DeWitts, an old Dutch bloodline that had grown rich under English rule. Each family had its own warehouses, its own fleet of ships, and, most importantly, its own secrets. Cornelis Vandermeer, the elder of the 2 brothers, had made his fortune in more than just grain. His Stone Street warehouse was full of boxes that never appeared in the ship's register. His brother Wilhelm often returned from his trips upriver with bags of money too heavy for a regular cargo of oats. Their porters were poor Dutchmen who spoke no English and never asked questions. They worked when the moon was up and were gone before the break of dawn. The success made the English merchants angry. They came hoping to inherit the Dutch fortunes, only to find themselves excluded from all the lucrative business. The former governor Thomas Redgrave, though no longer in power, still had a voice in London. He sent letters to complain about the Dutch reflexes that were tearing the valves of English power through ill-gotten wealth and growing influence. Religion was also on the front line. The Dutch Reformed Church on Garden Street still kept its services in a lively Dutch accent, the hymns echoing outward like a formality to the newly erected Trinity Church nearby. The Reverend Hendrik Baas, head of the Dutch education, preached every Wednesday evening with words that would have made the English frown. His congregation attracted not only the Dutch, but also French Huguenots, and even some English converts who sought something more genuine than the overly formal Anglican services. It was in that plume of smoke, ethnic, commercial, and religious, that the first spark was ignited. October brought early hours to Manhattan Island, and with it, the yacht De Jonge Margriet, the Ork with the crushing mast, and half the crew missing. Captain Jan Krummen, an old Dutch sailor who has sailed these waters for 30 years, brings a story that would make even the most experienced oarsman pale. The French had taken Albany, or so it seemed. According to Captain Krummen, they had laid siege to the town for 3 days, then abruptly retreated north toward Montreal, without a trace, without explanation. But what was more alarming was what had happened along the Hudson. Several Dutch farm families, names that everyone knew, had vanished. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty houses, steaming meals on the tables, animals wandering the yards as if their owners had just evaporated from the world. Krummen, as usual, whispered the story to whoever bought him a drink at the Provost Tavern. "Even the Indians don't dare mention it," he muttered. "They're all religious Mohawks, but when they mention those farms, they cross themselves like they've seen the devil. And then, things took a turn for the worse at the wrong time. At Cornelis Vandenmeer's warehouse, the expected shipments from the Highlands had not arrived. Food and furs had all disappeared without warning. The warehouse was almost empty. Creditors had begun knocking on the door, and his brother Wilhelm, who had ridden north to investigate 2 weeks earlier, had heard nothing. Every afternoon, Margarita Vandenmeer, Cornelis's wife, would stand at her second-floor window looking out the road from the Bowery, waiting for a familiar sight. Margarita was a practical woman. She had survived the British occupation and 2 yellow fever epidemics. She was not easily swayed by sentiment. But the silence of the Highlands, once alive with the sound of horses and laughter, unsettled her to the core. On the morning of October 15th, a thick fog from the East River crept across the streets, silencing the sound of footsteps. Margarita walked to the Dutch Reformed Church as usual, but the heavy oak doors were wide open, and inside, there was only one person. Anna Kettler, the pastor's daughter, knelt before the altar trembling and murmuring prayers in Dutch so fast that she could not understand them. Her fingers were clenched until they were white. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Margarita heard a few broken words. "The devil walks among us. The blood of the innocent cries out. Tonight, they will come." She gently placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. "Annika, what is it that frightens you so much?" The girl raised her head. And in that moment, Margarita felt a chill run down her spine. Anna's eyes were dark, burning, with the instinctive terror of a cornered animal. "Mevaldra Vandenmeer," Anna whispered, taking Margarita's wrist, squeezing it with an incredible force. They told me to warn you. In the dream they said, "Your husband must not open the storeroom tonight. The boxes, there's something wrong in them." But before Margarita could ask, any more footsteps sounded from the church door. Pastor Bass appeared, his face heavy. Behind him were 2 men who made Margarita's heart sink: Captain John Lawrence of the Colonial Militia and Richard Townley, one of Governor Fletcher's judges. "Mrs. Vandenmeer," Townley said in a cold English accent, "we need to talk about your brother-in-law, Mr. Wilhelm." Finally, the question that had been lingering in Margarita's mind for days came out. "He's dead, isn't he?" "I found him 3 days ago," Captain Lawrence replied, "about 20 miles away, near Clavik. But the strange thing wasn't the death, it was what we found in his saddlebags." At Judge Townley's desk, 3 objects were laid out, like indictments from hell: a human skull carved with strange lines in a type no one had ever seen before. A vial of dark red blood, still liquid despite the cold October air. And finally, the most shocking, a detailed map detailing every farm along the Hudson population, livestock grain stocks, intelligence for the French. Wilhelm's throat had been slit, but the body had been laid out ceremoniously, arms outstretched, head turned north toward France. The Mohawks who found him refused to touch the body. They muttered only one word, which the interpreter translated as "he who walks in darkness." "Your brother-in-law is in league with the enemy." Townley declared, his eyes cold. The question now is, how deep does this conspiracy go? In Margarita's head, everything was spinning. Wilhelm, the French spy, the man who had been furious when he heard about the massacre of the Schenectady villagers who had paid out of his own pocket for weapons for the Albany militia. Impossible. Unless someone was trying to make it up. "There must be some mistake," she said slowly. "Will has always been loyal to the crown." "Perhaps," Townley replied, "but the loyalty of your people, the conquered, is often hard to predict, especially when French gold is on the table." The words left a heavy air of suspicion in the air. At that point, Reverend Bass spoke up, full of concern. "Judge, you can't convict an entire family on this shaky evidence. The Vandenmeers have always been pillars of the community." "We're also looking into your Wednesday night prayers," Townley interrupted. "Prayers in foreign languages, members with military information donations of unknown purpose. Perhaps it is time to re-examine all the pillars of this community." That evening, the news of Wilhelm's death spread throughout the Dutch quarter, and something like panic began to creep in. Families who had lived peacefully with their English neighbors suddenly looked back at every glance, every broken word, every seemingly harmless joke, as if all of it could be used as evidence against them. And Cornelis Vandenmeer, he walked like a ghost through his own warehouse, checking and rechecking the inventory, checking every wooden crate, the crates that someone or something was paying too much attention to. The wooden crates Annika had warned him about, they stood in neat rows against the east wall of the warehouse, looking nothing special. According to the books, they were just grain, a regular shipment from the riverside farms, nothing more. But as Cornelis Vandenmeer tapped his knuckles on 3 of them, a wave of unease washed over him. They were lighter than they should have been, as if they were half as heavy. He took a crowbar and pried open the lid of the first one. The smell made him gag. Not grain, but something organic, rotten. In the flickering light of the whale oil lamp, he saw human hair floating in a dark liquid, thick as coagulated blood. Hands shaking, he opened the second crate. More hair, more smell, and worse pieces of green cloth, the woolen cloth that Dutch peasant women loved. The third crate contained something that made him want to collapse in despair. A toy, a tiny wooden horse. Its paint faded its back, smooth from being cradled by tiny hands. It bobbed in the dark water as if floating in the darkness. Someone had used his warehouse to dispose of evidence of missing farm families. Someone had made him an unwitting accomplice to a massacre, and tomorrow, when Magistrate Townley and his search party came with a warrant, they would find crates full of bodies, and no amount of explanation from Cornelis would make him immune to the crime. He stood in the flickering light, his gaze fixed on the evidence before him, the crates that had sealed off the future. Then, footsteps echoed on the stone outside the door, slowly, deliberately, as if someone or something was waiting. Cornelius quickly turned off the light, pressed his back against the wall, and held his breath. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound that made his skin prickle. The light scratching of fingernails on wood, slow, sequential, tracing something he couldn't see but felt deep in his bones. The scratching continued a haunting rhythm that seemed to last forever and then stopped, abruptly, as if it had never been there. When he shakily opened the door, the street was deserted, empty. Only a symbol had been carved into the wooden frame of the main door. Still fresh, the white cut stood out against the old wood. That symbol. He had seen it before. On the skull, he had found in his brother's saddlebag. Dawn brought the sound of British boots, each step tapping on the cobblestones of Stone Street like a hammer on an anvil. Rumors had spread through Holland Street. The Vandermeer warehouse was to be searched. Cornelius did not sleep all night. He carried each crate down into the cellar, then scrubbed the floor with lime and sand, hoping to wash away the scent of crime. But the truth had a way of lingering. The smell was still there, faint but unmistakable, to anyone who knew what they were looking for. Captain Lawrence was the first to smell it. "What are you storing here, Vandermeer?" he asked, his hand already on the hilt of his sword. "Wheat and barley." Cornelius replied, trying to keep his voice even as his stomach churned. "From the Hudson farms as usual. The same farms where people are disappearing." Townley added, his voice tinged with lead. "What a coincidence." The search was thorough and professional. They found the strange symbol engraved on the doorframe, copied on parchment. They smelled a strange odor in the air. They found the crowbar that Cornelius had left by the empty shelves on which there were traces of a thick liquid like tar. But they did not find the wooden boxes. That was until 2 days later, when little Annika Kettler began to have visions. In the middle of Sunday service, Pastor Bass was preaching when Annika suddenly stood up in the pew, her eyes lifeless, staring straight into space, her voice echoing through the church like wind through stone, whispering, but impossible to ignore. "I see them," she said in Dutch. "Under the stone, under the house with the terrace. They are demanding justice. They are demanding blood." The entire congregation held their breath. No one moved. Annika continued speaking. Her voice grew stronger, sharper. Her description made the blood run cold. Bones hidden beneath the city, in cellars, garden corners, and under houses from the Bowery to the docks. Children's clothes, human bones, buckets soaked in blood. Worst of all, she described Cornelius Vandermeer's cellar in perfect detail. Every placement of the barrel, every item, even the little wooden horse floating in the black liquid. The truth, no matter how deep it is hidden, knows how to find its way to the surface. And from that moment, Cornelius's fate was carved into history with knives, blood, and fire. Magistrate Townley, who had been attending service at Trinity Church, arrived at the Dutch Reformed Church within an hour. By evening, Cornelius was handcuffed and locked in Fort James, and his warehouse was searched by British soldiers with shovels and oil lamps. They found everything Anna had described in exact detail: 3 wooden crates containing badly decomposed human remains, unidentifiable, but with enough clothing and personal effects to confirm their identity, the missing Dutch peasant families. The evidence was overwhelming, too overwhelming, and impossible to justify. But Margaretha Vanderburg was not a woman who would accept the impossible. When her husband was accused of mass murder and treason, Margaretha began her own investigation. She started with the young girl who knew exactly where the evidence would destroy the Vanderburg family. Anicha Ketelias lived with her father, Pastor Bay, in a small house behind the church. It was a neat house smelling of beeswax and dried herbs that the pastor used to heal the parishioners. The girl had been acting strangely for weeks, her father admitted when Margaretha visited to share her troubles. She hardly slept. Pastor Bay sighed, his face lined with worry. And when she did, she talked in her sleep, using words I had never heard before. The voice seemed to come from a time even older than Dutch. Did she say where those words came from? Margaretha asked softly. Yes, the pastor replied, avoiding her gaze. She said they came to see her, 3 women in black cloaks. They showed her everything, told her everything. But what scared me most, Margaretha, was that she knew things she couldn't know. Details about families I'd never told her about. Events that had happened before she was born. That night, Margaretha lingered in the churchyard until she saw the faint glow of candles in Anna's room. The girl was sitting at a small writing table, copying something from a book Margaretha couldn't see clearly. And then, from the cemetery behind, 3 figures in dark cloaks approached the house. Do you remember that creepy feeling when someone stares at your back in the dark? Margaretha felt it multiplied tenfold. They didn't walk, they just floated across the ground. So close, she could hear the rustle of cloth on grass. They were not dressed in black as rumored, but in deep purple. And they made no sound, as if they were used to hiding in the dark. One carried a leather bag, the second carried a scroll of what looked like an ancient book, and the third carried a human skull. Margaretha held her breath, pressed against the icy brick wall, and watched the 3 figures enter Anicha's house. And in that moment, she understood clearly and without a doubt that her family was not simply the victim of a supernatural coincidence. It was the target. Someone or some force was using the girl as a tool, a puppet. Those visions were not revelations from God, but intentional information given to Anicha to create a story that anyone who heard it would believe. The question was no longer what was going on, but who's pulling the strings and why. If you're feeling chills, don't keep them to yourself. Share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, and don't forget to like it. To help the channel continue telling the untold stories. We'll find out what happens next. Over the next weeks, Margaretha began to change. She went from grieving wife to truth seeker. She quietly built a network of informants, Dutch maids, who worked in English households invisible to their masters, but who heard everything. What they told us was more chilling than any prophecy. The plot against the Dutch merchant families had been brewing for months by an alliance of English merchants and colonial officials who saw the war with France as the perfect opportunity to seize control of New York's most lucrative trade route. Former Governor Thomas Dongan corresponded with Boston and Philadelphia merchants, sharing Dutch shipping schedules, warehouse inventories, and even family connections within the community. The letters Margarita collected from her network of informants painted a very different picture from the one the colonial authorities were preaching. It was not war nor the French nor the natives, it was cold greed disguised as patriotism. Former Governor Thomas Dongan wrote to a Boston merchant, "The Dutch in this colony are not only a commercial menace, but a moral menace. Their continued prosperity under English rule has convinced our enemies that conquest, not obedience, is the reward. We must prove that loyalty to the crown is the only way to safety and success." Do you sense a rift in the story? As it turns out, the disappeared peasant families were not murdered. They were forcibly resettled by the English forces themselves. The bloodshed was all an act. The rest, the evidence in the Vanderburg storage room, were just cattle bones, carefully colored and arranged under whale oil lamps to fool the eye. But that was not the scariest part. The 3 women Margarita had seen visiting little Anecha were not ghosts, nor were they French spies. They were the wives of the most powerful men in the colony. Sarah Livingston, the wife of Scottish merchant Robert Livingston. Mary Phillips, the wife of Frederick Phillips, who controlled almost the entire Hudson River trade route. And most shocking of all, Elizabeth Fletcher, the wife of the current governor, Benjamin Fletcher. The 3 women had used Anatia as an unconscious prophet. They had planted carefully prepared words in her head, repeated over and over again in ritualistic episodes with purple robes, ancient props, and mysterious language. It was all staged to convince a devout young woman that she was receiving a message from heaven. The plan was as sophisticated as it was cruel. A prophecy could not be questioned. To doubt it was to blaspheme God. And who could deny the word of an innocent child raised in their own community, the daughter of a respected pastor? The evidence would be accidentally discovered. The prophecy would lead to the hiding place, and the Dutch property would be seized as treason, then quietly transferred to those loyal to the crown. Do you see the cold perfection of the plan? But Margarita discovered it too late. The next stage of the plot had begun. On November 12th, little Anatia Ketelas appeared in court at Fort James. For the first time, she spoke English so fluently that it took the whole courtroom by surprise. "Cornelius confessed to me," she said. He said the French had promised him land in Quebec. The room was filled with unblinking Englishmen. Anatia recounted the secret conversation she had with Cornelius, where he admitted to helping the French resettle Dutch families and would be rewarded with titles and land. Every word, every sentence was delivered in a clear, crisp voice without a hint of hesitation. It was all the more heartbreaking because the testimony made perfect sense. The French did have influence in the Hudson Valley, and the Dutch had long-standing ties to the Huguenot refugee community. Moreover, it explained every flaw in the prosecution's argument. Why was the body so decomposed that it was unrecognizable? Because the crime had happened months earlier. Why had the evidence been moved into the cellar? Because Cornelius felt he was being watched. Cornelius was not allowed to defend himself under English law. Traitors were forbidden to speak lest they spread subversive ideas. The court-appointed lawyer, a young man named William Peterson, was too busy speeding up proceedings to argue. The outcome was foreordained. The verdict was swift. Cornelius Vanderburg would be hanged for treason and murder. His property would be confiscated and distributed to the faithful and virtuous subjects. However, on the morning of November 19th, as Cornelius was writing his last letter to his wife in his cell, Margarita entered Judge Townley's chambers with a heavy leather bag. "I bring evidence," she said, setting the bag down on the table. The clanking sound of it silenced the small room. Judge Townley raised an eyebrow. "What kind of evidence is that, madam?" Margarita didn't blink. "Proof that my husband is innocent. And more importantly, it shows who is really guilty." She opened the bag. Inside was a series of letters, all in Thomas Dongan's own handwriting. The letters detailed the plan, a schedule for the forced resettlement of Dutch families, a list of properties to be seized, and the names of English merchants who would be given first priority. Do you want to know what happens when the truth is revealed? Will Cornelius be exonerated, or will Margarita be silenced forever? Leave a comment if you're feeling as outraged as I am. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next part will change the way you think about colonial justice. The letters Margarita collected were more than evidence. They were confessions written in black ink and red blood of greed. In a letter to his Boston counterpart, former Governor Thomas Dongan wrote, "The Dutch element in this colony is not only a commercial menace, but also a moral hazard. Their continued prosperity under British rule only serves to convince the enemy that conquest brings rewards rather than submission." To Margarita, each letter was a knife that cut into the moral mask worn by the ruling elite. The missing peasant families were not murdered by the French, nor were they victims of native tribes. They were organized removals, driven off their land in the dark, with their farms quietly changing hands with British Crown loyalists. The 3 crates of bones found in her husband's barn were not human. They were animal bones cleverly arranged to create a sense of terror in the dim light of whale oil lamps. And the 3 women in purple robes were not supernatural apparitions. They were Sarah Linton, wife of a wealthy Scottish merchant, Mary Felton, wife of the Hudson River merchant, and most shocking of all, Elizabeth Fairchild, wife of the current governor, Benjamin Fairchild. They approached young Annika Callas, planting carefully staged revelations in the innocent girl's mind. The purple robes, the skulls, the ancient language, the strange ritual objects, it was all stage. An elaborate play to convince Annika that she was a messenger from God. And the audience believed, because who would dare doubt the will of God? What do you think of the subtlety? Leave a comment. Did you see the trick, or did you believe it as the rest of the community did? November 12th. Annika Callas stood before the court at Fort James, and for the first time in her life, she spoke in English fluently, clearly, with the monotony of a blind angel reading the Bible. She said that Cornelius, Margarita's husband, had confessed all his crimes to her in a private meeting at church. He said the French had promised him land in Quebec. He boasted about the number of families he had helped move in exchange for rewards from France when the war ended. Every detail, every word fit the picture the prosecution had painted. It was so perfect, it was almost suspicious. Cornelius was charged with treason and murder. He was not allowed to defend himself. British law did not allow rebels to speak in court. The lawyer appointed was inexperienced and seemed eager to get the case over with as quickly as possible. The sentence hanged within a week. The property was seized and redistributed to the faithful of the Anglican faith. But Margarita had one last move. On the morning of November 19th, she entered Judge Townley's office carrying a heavy leather bag. Inside was not a weapon, but the truth, sharp and deadly than any blade. She placed the bag on the table. "I have evidence," she said, "not only to clear my husband's name, but to show who the real culprit was." Inside the bag were letters in Dongan's own hand detailing the plan to seize Dutch land, payroll records for militiamen who participated in night operations in the Hudson Valley, and most remarkable, a schedule of apparitions for Annika, signed by Elizabeth Fairchild. Judge Townley was speechless. "Where did you get these?" "From the same place where you got the bones for my storeroom," Margarita replied. And then she lowered the curtain. "Annika is with me, and she has come to her senses." She was ready to go to court again. She would tell every detail about the three powerful women, about the meetings, about the strange languages, the promises of paradise, and the collapse of faith. Townley paled. A girl was harder to fool than paper documents, especially when she could describe even the scent of Lady Fairchild's room. "What do you want?" he whispered. "My husband's freedom, the return of his property, and the right to leave the colony for all Dutch who wanted to leave. In return, my silence. Annika will not testify, and the documents will disappear." But Margarita had underestimated one thing: the desperation of the powerful when they are cornered. That evening, as she turned down the quiet Dutch quarter, two dark figures emerged from an alley. No threats, no warnings, just two arms pulling her along in silence. The small boat waited outside the dock, hidden in the mist drifting from the harbor. And in the pale moonlight, Margarita knew she was not the first victim, nor would she be the last. Ban hi kauchuyen, sekettu taijai hongju, wiki mat troi mok ngai, hom sao motyeng noi wang, lan tu buk gyang nhatho, gyong kwa mot ko gaitre Anika kalas ngoitong, la kong kukwa mot am mukin hoang, to jan fam toi voikat ngoi, ko noi gyong run hangro rang, toi la wuki juok su dang jetiao diet nhang ngoi votoi, ko keven hung boy gap, vebang ngoi punu mangdan quen qui, ven hung loi doi tra juok string, bain hu sam truyen, ko ke hetten thoi gyan jia jiem mux jik, mot thok jiathuk gyak, mot toi achbi foi bai. Va mot ko gaishon noi su, dat bat chap hau kwa, ban kotin vaukong, lihai nochila, mot kai niem tui vaukenau, nam kuyen hoi kung toi kam, fa fan kuoi kung, kua kauchuyen, o fantiep dheo, the letters. Margarita found painted a grim picture of greed disguised as loyalty. In a letter to his Boston associates, former Governor Thomas Darley wrote, "The Dutch element in this colony is not only a commercial menace, but a moral hazard. Their prosperity under English rule sends the false message that conquest leads to reward. We must prove that loyalty to the crown is the only way to safety and success." As it turned out, the missing farming families had not been murdered by the natives or the French. They had been systematically removed by the English themselves. The raids were a cover. The empty farms were quickly taken over by families loyal to the English. And the pile of human bones found in Cornelius's storeroom, they were simply animal bones arranged under the light of whale oil lamps to fool the eye. What shocked Margarita most, however, was the identity of the three mysterious women she had seen frequenting Antira's house. They were neither witches nor French spies. They were the wives of three of the most powerful men in the colony. Sarah Livingston, the wife of a wealthy Scottish merchant, Mary Phillips, the wife of the man who controlled almost all the Hudson River trade, and finally, most shockingly, Elizabeth Fletcher, the wife of Governor Benjamin Fletcher. These three women turned Antira into an unconscious prophet, planting in her mind staged images, false prophecies that painted a picture of the crimes of the Dutch. From the purple robes to the rituals and ancient languages, all were elaborate theatre to deceive a devout girl. And dear audience, try to put yourself in the shoes of the Dutch people at that time. Who would doubt a pious young woman, a minister's daughter raised in the bosom of the community? Who would dare challenge a message from God? On November 12th, 1692, at the Fort James courthouse, before a packed crowd, Antira testified. She told how Cornelius himself had confessed to being a French agent, helping to move families out of the colony and preparing them for land in Quebec. The testimony seemed fantastical, but was terrifyingly plausible. It filled in all the gaps in the case. Cornelius was barred by law from defending himself. His lawyer, a young Englishman named Peter Warren, was little more than a spectator. The verdict was quickly read: treason and murder. The sentence was death by hanging. His property was confiscated. But Margarita was not giving up. On November 19th, she went to see Judge Townley carrying a heavy leather bag. "I have evidence," she said, looking straight ahead. Townley, initially disdainful, could not ignore her as she placed them on the table, one by one. Darley's letters describing the relocation plot, payrolls for the guards on the nights of the acts, and finally a schedule of Antira's appearances signed by Elizabeth Fletcher. When Townley doubted their authenticity, Margarita only smiled. "You can doubt the papers. But what about the living witnesses?" She announced Antira was under her protection and was ready to testify, to tell everything she knew, from the voices to the intonations of the three noble women. Townley paled. No paper could be more terrifying than a young woman who was ready to stand before the people and expose everything. That evening, as she returned home through the deserted Dutch quarter, Margarita was dragged into the darkness by two strangers. No threats, no warnings. She was tied up and taken out to the river in a small boat. Her cries for help faded into the dense fog. She knew she had lost. The people behind this plot were not people, they were a system. And the system willing to kill to save itself. But they had underestimated her. The next morning, when Margarita's body was found near Whitehall, Slip Antira stood in the pulpit of the Dutch Reformed Church, preparing to deliver her fateful sermon. "I have sinned," she began, her voice trembling but steady. "I have become an instrument of lies," she finished. From the first meeting with the three women, to the detailed instructions, to the staged dialogue, to the designated prophetic evidence. And then she produced copies of the documents Margarita had given Townley. They had been hidden in the church just in case. Can you guess what happened next? Within hours, the people were marching on Fort James, demanding Cornelius's release and the arrest of the English merchants involved in the plot. By the afternoon, the wave of anger had spread not only from the Dutch but also from the French, the Germans, and even some English who could not accept this betrayal. Governor Fletcher knew that denial was no longer an option. The evidence was too clear. he chose to sacrifice a name, Thomas Darley was arrested for treason. The 3 guards who had been involved in the staged evidence were executed. The English merchants had their assets frozen. And in a solemn ceremony, Cornelius was released, his property restored, and a public apology was made to his family. But the justice did not ease the pain. The Dutch no longer believed in justice. Many followed Margarita's advice while she was still alive, leaving New York for Pennsylvania, where William Penn promised religious freedom. Those who stayed lived cautiously incognito without fanfare. The events of 1692 became a part of history that no one mentioned but no one forgot. It was not until the fire of 1911 that the truth was almost buried. But a few diary pages, a few letters, a few church records survived. Antera lived until 1734. She never forgave herself. She spent the rest of her life in a convent in New Jersey, caring for orphans and immigrants. She died still haunted by the 3 women in purple robes. And Cornelius, he lived quietly, retreating from the business world. In 1718 he died, carrying with him a question that perhaps no one has dared to answer to this day. When justice is bargained with lives, is it still justice? If you are still here, thank you for joining Sleepy History Tales on this journey. A dark, multi-layered story, but also a reminder that history is not just what is recorded, but also what is hidden. But those who knew Cornelius said he was never the same after his imprisonment. He rebuilt his business, yes, but the confidence was gone. So was the community that had once trusted him implicitly. Success, he'd learned, could be mistaken for sedition by those who envied it. His descendants gradually anglicized their surname to Vanderburg, quietly folding into English society. Their Dutch heritage became something remembered in whispers, not worn with pride. The English merchants who had orchestrated the conspiracy met varied ends. A few fled to other colonies where their reputations wouldn't follow. Others adapted, switching to more conventional methods of acquisition and influence. Some faced social exile that drove them from New York entirely. But none faced justice proportional to the destruction they had caused. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of the forgotten witch hunt of 1692 was how thoroughly it revealed the fragility of colonial justice. A legal system that nearly executed an innocent man based on planted evidence and supernatural visions punished the real conspirators with little more than inconvenience. The same magistrates who once treated a girl's dreams as gospel turned suddenly skeptical when confronted with actual documents implicating their peers. The lesson was clear in colonial America. Truth was what those in power said it was. Justice wasn't blind, it simply refused to look too closely if the accused had the right friends. That pattern would repeat itself across American history. Salem's trials are the most infamous example, but they were far from unique. Every generation would find its scapegoats, the too successful, the too different, the too trusting in the protection of the law. The Dutch families of 1692 New York were simply the first to learn a hard truth. The greatest threats to freedom don't always arrive by sea or land with foreign banners. Sometimes they come from across the street from neighbors whose envy turns into fear, whose fear becomes justification, and whose justification ends in violence. In the end, the witch hunt of 1692 wasn't about witchcraft at all. It was about power. It was about greed and how easily righteousness can be weaponized to serve it. The documents uncovered in the Stavrant family estate offer only fragments, but fragments can still tell a story if someone is brave enough to follow the trail and persistent enough to read between the burned pages and forgotten names. They remind us that the past doesn't always stay buried and that the records of the righteous and the wicked often lie side by side in dusty archives waiting to be noticed. Today, as we walk the streets of Lower Manhattan, we tread on ground where this story unfolded. Stone Street still winds through the financial district, but its cobblestones no longer echo with Dutch cartwheels or trilingual bargaining. The stepped gable houses are gone, replaced by glass towers. The East River docks where Margarita Vanderberg met her end now lie beneath the concrete sweep of the FDR Drive. But if you know where to look, traces remain. In forgotten church registers, in land deeds showing sudden transfers of property during the autumn of 1692. In gravestones with Dutch names clustered together in quiet corners of cemeteries, their dates hinting at a storm that history never officially recorded. This has been Sleepy History Tales. If this story spoke to you, if it made you think twice about what we forget and why we forget, consider sharing it with someone who loves the shadows between the pages of history. Like, subscribe, and join us again as we unearth the stories time tried to bury. Because sometimes the past isn't gone, it's just sleeping. Perhaps the most haunting remains are not in the history books, but below ground, the old basement of the warehouse Cornelius Vanderberg once owned on Stone Street. Today, it is a tavern that caters to Wall Street financiers, and the original stone foundation still bears strange markings. Many people think they are decorations left by some ancient craftsman. But anyone who has ever looked through the documents in the Stavrant collection will recognize the markings. They are the symbols that mark buildings targeted for confiscation. Perhaps the most chilling thing is not that the plot actually happened, but that it succeeded so completely. By 1700, the influence of Dutch merchants in New York had been all but eliminated. The English and Scots controlled the major trade routes, owned the warehouses, and controlled the credit networks that were the heart of all commerce in the time. The dislodging of Dutch merchant families from the economic center was accomplished more quietly in the decades that followed, through taxes, licenses, and legal regulations, rather than through witchcraft accusations and dramatic trials. The 1692 plot taught its architects an important lesson. There was no need to scream about the devil when a tax return could destroy a family and with less risk of being discovered. More than 300 years later, the story raises questions that extend far beyond the colonial era. How many witch hunts in history were actually cover-ups for economic gain? How many times has religion been exploited to serve material interests? And most troubling of all, how many times have Americans convinced themselves that oppression is patriotism, that plunder is justice, and that conspiracy is public service? The tragedy of the Vanderbergs reminds us that the most dangerous enemies of freedom do not always have to bear arms. Sometimes they just know how to dress their greed in a moral cloak and whisper to the public that destruction is necessary for the so-called common good. In 1692, 3 women in purple cloaks could convince a young woman that God wanted her to destroy her neighbor. Today, those cloaks have been replaced by social media algorithms, television anchors, and carefully crafted political messaging. But the essence remains the same: to sow fear, to breed suspicion, to turn ordinary people into instruments of evil if the cause is compelling enough. The documents in the Stuyvesant collection are no comfort to those who prefer simple, heroic histories. They reveal a colonial America where justice could be bought, where religion was manipulated, and where people were often led to play the role of persecutor out of fear. But they also reveal something else: the power of those who dare to ask questions, to confront the truth when everyone around them chooses a comfortable silence, to sacrifice to preserve the memory of a future generation who might have the courage to accept the truth. Margarita Vanderburg died trying to expose the conspiracy that destroyed her community. Annie Catella spent her life atoning for her unwitting role in the persecution. Cornelius, though he survived, never forgot the fragility of what he once thought was solid. Their story shows us that in any society, any era, the line between civilization and chaos is sometimes just the presence of a few people who dare to say, "I will not be silent. I will not participate. This is wrong." The forgotten New York witch hunt of 1692 was never forgotten. It was just buried under the dust of willful forgetting and collective guilt. But buried is not erased. And sometimes all it takes is one person at the right time asking the right question, for the truth to emerge like Margarita's body in the East River, damaged, disfigured, but undeniable. As we close this dark chapter in history, what happened in 1692 makes us shudder when we look at the present. The tricks that destroyed Dutch families did not disappear. They just changed shape. Every generation has its own three ladies in purple people who understand that fear spreads faster than truth, and that ordinary people can be seduced into evil if the cause is sacred enough. The plot works because it gives the masses what they crave: simple solutions to complex problems, clear villains to ambiguous situations, and a sense of morality in carrying out exploitative acts. Only when people like Margarita Vanderburg dare to refuse does the truth have a chance to survive. And that is the choice for every generation: to be Margarita, or to be one of the crowds watching Cornelius being led to execution. It is a choice between comfortable blindness and dangerous awareness, between safe compliance and costly resistance. The Dutch in New York in 1692 learned this: prosperity without vigilance is fragile. Success without power is temporary, and justice without courage is just a temporary concession from those who want to destroy you. What do you think of this story? Do you think all the mysteries have been exposed? Or is there something else hidden somewhere under Manhattan? Have you ever wondered how many witch hunts in American history? Are they really just masks for more trivial conspiracies? Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts on this forgotten chapter of colonial history. If you found this story fascinating and want to explore more dark corners that official history has forgotten, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any past investigations, and share this video with those who love mysteries that are blurred between history and horror. Because sometimes the truth of the past is scarier than any fiction. See you in the next video, where we will continue to shine a light on the shadows that mainstream history always wants to hide.